Early 1942. The Pacific was tense and full of danger. Just weeks had passed since the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Across the ocean, American forces scrambled to recover, while Japan pushed forward with its plans to control the region. On a remote Japanese airbase, pilots readied their planes for another strike. Mechanics checked engines, fuel crews filled tanks, and commanders reviewed last-minute details. The pilots believed they held the advantage. Their plan was secret. They expected to launch into the sky, travel unseen, and strike before the enemy had time to react. The Japanese had used this tactic many times before. Surprise had been their most reliable weapon. At Pearl Harbor, their carriers approached undetected. Their aircraft struck with devastating effect. Since then, they had continued to rely on stealth, assuming the Americans were blind beyond the horizon. What they did not know was that the Americans had been quietly preparing a new form of defense. On a distant island, inside a small building near the coast, a different kind of battle unfolded. American radar operators sat in front of glowing screens. Strange lines and dots moved across the displays. These men were not pilots or gunners. Their job was to see what others could not. They worked with equipment like the SCR-270, a large, rotating antenna that sent out radio waves. When those waves bounced back off a solid object, such as an aircraft, the radar painted a signal on the screen. It was crude by modern standards, but for 1942 it was remarkable. Until now, most military forces relied on lookouts with binoculars or scouts flying patrols. Human eyes could only see so far. Clouds, darkness, and distance hid the enemy. Radar changed that, could detect aircraft far beyond visual range. In some cases, it could track planes before they even left the ground. This technology was still new and secret. Many in the Japanese military did not believe the Americans had anything like it. As the Japanese pilots climbed into their cockpits, the radar stations had already detected unusual activity. The operators noticed a cluster of signals forming near a known enemy airfield. They studied the patterns. The signals were not just random. They moved with purpose. The operators knew what it meant. Enemy planes were being readied for takeoff. Messages raced through American communications channels. Commanders were alerted. Air defense units were ordered to stand by. Pilots ran to their own planes. The Americans had a chance to strike first, but it required trust in this new radar system. Some officers were cautious. They had never seen an enemy force detected before it was airborne. The information felt almost impossible. But as more reports came in, the picture grew clear. The Japanese raid was about to begin, and the Americans would be ready. At the Japanese airfield, engines roared to life. Pilots gave final hand signals to ground crews. They had no idea that hundreds of miles away, men were watching their every move on glowing screens. The first group of planes lifted off. The moment they cleared the runway, American fighters were already climbing to meet them. Anti-aircraft guns were aimed and loaded. The Japanese expected to surprise a sleeping enemy. Instead, they flew straight into a prepared defense. The initial clash was chaotic. Japanese pilots were stunned to face interceptors so soon. Radio chatter filled their headsets. Some thought they had been betrayed by spies. Others believed American patrols had gotten lucky. They could not understand how their secret plan had been exposed before it even began. American pilots reported a different experience. Their controllers gave precise directions based on radar data. They knew where to go and what to expect. This level of coordination was new. It gave them confidence as they dove into the fight. The sky turned into a deadly swirl of twisting planes and tracer fire. The Japanese lost aircraft quickly. Their formation broke apart before it could reach its target. Back at the radar stations, operators watched the battle play out in real time. Each fading signal meant a downed enemy plane. The operators remained calm, focusing on tracking any reinforcements. For them, it was a quiet victory. No one cheered. Their role was to see and to guide, not to fight directly. When the surviving Japanese pilots returned to base, confusion and anger spread through their ranks. Their commanders demanded answers. How could the Americans have been so ready? Some pilots suggested that radar was involved, but most dismissed the idea. At the time, Japan had little experience with radar technology. Their doctrine still relied on traditional scouting and visual detection. American leaders reviewed the battle and recognized its importance. Radar had shifted the balance. It had provided an invisible layer of defense. It had allowed them to respond with speed and precision. The success proved that technology could change the course of a fight before a single shot was fired. As news of the encounter spread within the U.S. military, more resources were poured into radar research and deployment. Crews received better training. New stations were built on islands across the Pacific. By the end of 1942, radar coverage was expanding, forming a protective net around American forces. For the Japanese, the encounter raised troubling questions. They began to suspect that their enemy possessed tools they did not understand. The certainty they had felt after Pearl Harbor started to erode. Each future mission carried a shadow of doubt. If the Americans could see them before they took off once, they might be able to do it again. The quiet work of a few radar operators on a distant island had altered the rhythm of the war. While battles still raged with guns and planes, an unseen struggle was taking place behind the scenes. Those glowing screens and rotating antennas would continue to shape events in ways the Japanese could not yet imagine. In the early months of 1942, the Pacific War was still in its first violent phase. The Japanese military seemed unstoppable. Their navy moved swiftly across the ocean, seizing territory and striking with precision. They relied on well-planned attacks, secrecy, and speed. At Pearl Harbor, they had caught the Americans completely unprepared. That success gave them confidence that their methods would continue to work. They believed they knew how to hide their movements and approach undetected. What they did not realize was that the Americans had been quietly building something that would soon change the balance. On scattered islands across the Pacific, unusual towers began to rise. These were not watchtowers or gun emplacements. They were radar stations. The United States had invested in radar research even before the war began. Scientists and engineers worked with the Army Signal Corps to create devices that could send out bursts of radio waves into the sky. When those waves hit something solid, such as a metal aircraft, they bounced back. Operators could read the returning signal on a display screen and calculate the distance and direction of the object. The SCR-270 and its companion model, the SCR-271, were the first large-scale radar systems deployed by the U.S. military. The SCR-270 was a mobile unit mounted on trucks. Its tall, rectangular antenna could be folded and moved between locations. The SCR-271 was a fixed installation, housed inside a permanent structure. Both were crude by modern standards. They lacked the clear images and precision of later systems, but they worked. Even with their limitations, they could detect aircraft far beyond what human eyes could see. Under the right conditions, a skilled operator could track planes more than 100 miles away. This capability was revolutionary. Until then, a military force had only two ways to know an enemy was coming. The first was to post lookouts on high ground or on ships. These men scanned the horizon with binoculars, hoping to spot incoming planes before they were overhead. The second was to send patrol aircraft to fly search patterns and report back what they saw. Both methods depended on visibility. If it was night, cloudy, or raining, a whole fleet could move unseen. Radar eliminated those limits. It worked day and night, in clear skies or fog. It extended a commander's reach far past the coastline, providing precious minutes, or even hours, of warning. When a radar station detected a signal, it did not show a picture like modern screens. Instead, a green line swept across a circular display. Small spikes appeared along the line where the signal bounced back. It took skill to interpret these readings. The operators had to distinguish real aircraft from birds, weather, or mechanical interference. A well-trained crew could read these subtle patterns and identify the size and movement of incoming planes. The Japanese military had almost no experience with this technology at the start of the war. They relied on traditional scouting. Pilots flew reconnaissance missions to locate enemy forces. Coast watchers and observers reported what they saw. This system had worked well enough against opponents who lacked long-range sensors. When they struck at Pearl Harbor, the Americans were relying on human lookouts and a few scattered radar units still in training. That lack of coordination allowed the attack to succeed. After Pearl Harbor, the Americans accelerated radar deployment. By January 1942, new stations were being built on key islands. Crews trained constantly, learning to spot subtle changes on their screens and to relay information quickly to fighter bases and anti-aircraft batteries. The goal was simple: create a network that could see the enemy coming long before they reached their target. For Japanese planners, this possibility seemed unlikely. They knew the Americans were recovering from heavy losses. They assumed radar was either unavailable or too limited to matter. Their strategy did not account for the possibility of being seen before takeoff. They continued to plan their missions as if secrecy alone guaranteed success. This misunderstanding would cost them dearly. While Japanese pilots prepared for a raid, American radar stations were already watching. As ground crews warmed up engines and rolled aircraft into position, the rotating antennas hundreds of miles away registered faint but growing signals. The operators marked the positions on their boards and sent updates through secure lines. By the time the first Japanese aircraft lifted into the air, their presence was known. The key advantage of radar lay not just in detection but in coordination. With early warning, American commanders could make informed decisions. They could launch interceptors in time to climb to the right altitude. Anti-aircraft guns could be manned and ready before the enemy was even visible. Entire bases could shift from a normal routine to full combat readiness within minutes. The Japanese, lacking this tool, remained blind to what awaited them. Their fighters and bombers flew in formation, confident that they had the element of surprise. They could not see the network of screens and radios tracking their every move. To them, the ocean was empty until the moment they encountered resistance. The SCR-270 and SCR-271 systems had weaknesses. They were large, fragile, and required constant maintenance. Power supply was always a concern on remote islands. The equipment could not pinpoint altitude with high precision, and sometimes false readings caused confusion. Yet, even with these flaws, the systems gave the Americans a decisive edge. For the first time, they could sense the shape of an approaching attack before it arrived. This difference in awareness created a new kind of warfare. Information became as important as weapons. A handful of operators, working quietly in dimly lit rooms, could influence the outcome of battles fought far away. Their readings shaped the actions of pilots, gunners, and commanders. The Japanese never fully understood how deeply this network had penetrated their plans. They believed their secrecy was intact, even as the Americans were watching their preparations in real time. As the months passed, radar would grow more advanced. New models extended range and improved accuracy. But in early 1942, even the basic systems were enough to change the course of a fight. What seemed like magic to Japanese pilots was, in truth, a careful application of science, engineering, and disciplined training. It was the invisible shield that began to turn the tide of the Pacific War. The night was calm over the Japanese airfield. The dark shape of planes lined the runway, their metal skins glinting under dim lights. Mechanics worked in silence, their hands moving with practiced speed as they tightened bolts and checked fuel lines. Pilots stood nearby, their flight gear ready, talking quietly among themselves. They believed the mission ahead would be routine. Their previous raids had met little resistance, and they trusted the element of surprise to carry them through again. Some smiled, making small jokes to ease the tension, while others focused on maps spread across a wooden table. The plan was simple: take off under cover of darkness, form into squadrons, and strike before sunrise. By the time the Americans realized what was happening, the attack would already be underway. Confidence ran high. No one suspected that, miles away, their every move was being tracked. On a small island across the ocean, inside a low building filled with humming machines, American radar operators leaned over glowing screens. The room smelled of metal and warm electronics. Thin green lines swept in slow, steady arcs across circular displays. First, the screens were quiet. Then faint marks appeared near the edge. One operator frowned and adjusted a dial. The marks were small and clustered together. "They're forming up," he said, his voice flat. The chief operator moved closer, scanning the pattern. It was clear and consistent. This was no weather disturbance or stray interference. These were aircraft, and they were still on the ground. The realization hit them hard. The enemy hadn't even taken off, yet they could see the formation starting to build. Call went out immediately. The information moved through a chain of command with speed and precision. Radio operators relayed exact bearings and estimated numbers to nearby airfields. The message was clear. Enemy planes were preparing to launch. American pilots, already sleeping in their flight suits, ran for their aircraft. Engines coughed to life in the dark, sending bursts of exhaust flame into the night. Back at the Japanese airfield, the first bombers rolled into position. Their engines roared, shaking the ground. Pilots gave quick hand signals to ground crews, then pushed their throttles forward. The planes lifted from the runway one by one, climbing into the dark sky. They expected to be invisible ghosts in the night. At the same moment, American fighters were already in the air. Guided by constant updates from radar stations, they rose to meet the incoming threat. The American pilots flew without hesitation. They did not have to search blindly for the enemy. They knew the exact direction and altitude to take. As they gained height, the horizon began to glow faintly with the first light of dawn. The two forces met in the sky before the Japanese had even completed their climb. The Japanese pilots were stunned. They had barely cleared their own coastline when tracer fire streaked past their wings. Confusion filled their radios. Some shouted warnings, others demanded to know how the Americans had found them so quickly. The formation broke apart as pilots scattered, trying to evade the sudden attack. From the ground, American anti-aircraft crews were also ready. The radar data had allowed them to aim their guns in advance. When the Japanese planes came into range, the sky erupted with shells. Explosions lit the clouds, and fragments of metal rained down. The Japanese pilots had no time to form up for an organized strike. They were forced into defensive maneuvers before they could even see their target. Inside the radar station, the operators worked with calm focus. They tracked the movement of the battle as blips shifted and disappeared. Each fading mark meant a downed aircraft. They passed constant updates to commanders and pilots. There was no cheering or celebration, only steady, precise communication. Their role was to see and to guide, not to fight directly. For the Japanese, the situation was unthinkable. They had expected to surprise a sleeping enemy, yet here they were, trapped in an ambush. Many believed there must have been spies on the ground giving away their plans. The idea that machines could detect them before takeoff seemed impossible. They had no frame of reference for what radar could do. As the fight dragged on, the Japanese losses mounted. Planes went down over the sea, their wreckage sinking into dark waters. Those who managed to escape turned back toward their base, fuel running low and nerves shattered. The mission had failed before it ever truly began. Meanwhile, the American fighters returned to their airfields with minimal losses. They landed to find ground crews waiting, already informed of the battle's outcome by radar reports. Commanders reviewed the data and knew exactly how the engagement had unfolded. They could see, step by step, how the warning system had allowed them to seize the advantage. The contrast between the two forces was stark. On one side, pilots relied on tradition and instinct, believing the ocean would hide their approach. On the other, technology provided foresight and coordination. The battle was not decided by numbers or bravery alone. It was decided by who could see first. In the days that followed, Japanese commanders tried to understand what had gone wrong. They questioned surviving pilots and examined every detail of the failed mission. Some suggested that the Americans had developed a new method of detection, but most dismissed the idea. It was easier to believe in bad luck or a single act of betrayal than to imagine a system that could watch their every move from hundreds of miles away. For the Americans, the event confirmed the value of their radar network. The operators who had spent long nights in silent rooms now had proof that their work mattered. They were part of a battle fought far beyond the limits of human sight, one that shaped the course of the war before the first shot was fired. The images of that night remained vivid for both sides. In Japanese memories, the sky filled with sudden gunfire and unseen enemies. In American recollections, the quiet glow of radar screens marked the moment when the balance began to shift. The clash in the air was fierce and visible, but the true drama had started long before, in the hidden rooms where dots on a screen foretold the outcome of a battle. The first moments of the encounter were a blur of noise and fire. Japanese pilots, barely clear of the runway, were suddenly surrounded by enemy fighters. Tracer rounds tore past their wings. Explosions lit the sky. It made no sense. They had launched in darkness, at a carefully chosen hour, under strict radio silence. No patrol aircraft had been seen in the area. By every measure they knew, surprise should have been theirs. Inside their cockpits, panic spread through the formation. Voices filled the radios at once. Questions overlapped with warnings. One pilot shouted that he saw American fighters above them, perfectly positioned to strike. Another swore they were under fire from the ground before they even reached altitude. Some cursed, others demanded answers. How did they know we were coming? One voice broke through, sharp and terrified. There was no reply. No one had an explanation. The squadron leader tried to restore order, barking commands, but the attack was too sudden. The formation collapsed as pilots scattered in every direction, each man trying to survive. Some dove toward the sea, hoping to escape beneath the clouds. Others climbed higher, desperate to outmaneuver their attackers. It was chaos. Bombers that were meant to travel in a steady line now flew alone, vulnerable and exposed. For these pilots, the moment felt unnatural. The Americans had been ready as if they had been waiting all along. It was not like facing an enemy patrol that stumbled upon them by chance. This was precise. The timing, the positions, the first shots fired before the raid even began. It was as if the Americans could see through the night itself. On the ground at the Japanese base, confusion spread just as quickly. Radio operators listened to the reports with growing dread. They could hear the disbelief in the pilots' voices, mixed with anger and fear. Some officers suspected a spy had leaked their plans. Others believed that an American ship must have been nearby, its scouts watching from close range. No one imagined that machines hundreds of miles away were tracking every movement. Above the sea, the shock turned to desperation. Planes fell one after another, their wreckage sinking into the dark water below. Pilots who managed to escape the immediate attack turned back toward home, only to find themselves harassed by more interceptors along the way. The entire mission, planned with care and secrecy, dissolved before their eyes. Meanwhile, at the American radar station, the mood was entirely different. The operators sat in a dim room, their faces lit by the green glow of the screens. They had tracked the enemy from the moment the first engine started. Now they watched the battle unfold as blips on their displays shifted and disappeared. Each fading mark meant a destroyed aircraft. They spoke little, their voices calm and measured as they relayed updates to commanders. For many of these men, this was their first time seeing radar play such a decisive role. Most were young and new to the service. Before the war, they had been students, farmhands, or factory workers. Few had ever imagined they would hold a tool that could shape the outcome of a battle. In the early days, their work was often dismissed as technical support, far removed from the real fighting. That perception changed as reports came in. Pilots who had scrambled into the air moments earlier now sent back messages of success. Anti-aircraft crews confirmed kills. The attack had been stopped before it reached its target. Commanders praised the precision of the radar readings and the speed of the warnings. Word spread quickly through the base. The system had worked exactly as intended. Relief filled the room. Some operators allowed themselves a brief smile. Others simply sat back, exhausted but proud. They knew how close the situation had been. Without their detection, the enemy raid might have struck American positions with deadly force. Instead, they had turned the tables. One operator, barely 20 years old, stared at the blank space on his screen where the enemy formation had been minutes before. He understood that each mark represented men he would never see, men who had set out believing they were safe and hidden. The weight of that knowledge settled over him. It was a quiet, sobering victory. Back in the air, the surviving Japanese pilots faced a long flight home. The silence on their radios was heavy. Those who spoke did so in short, clipped sentences. They had no answers for what had happened. Some replayed the battle in their minds, trying to find a clue. Others were simply grateful to be alive. The mission had been a failure, but worse than that, it had revealed something deeply unsettling. When they landed, officers surrounded them with questions. The pilots described what they had seen. American fighters arriving with perfect timing, ground defenses already active, the entire strike force intercepted before it had a chance to fight back. Their words carried the same theme. The enemy had known everything in advance. For the Americans, the news confirmed what they had already seen on their screens. The radar crews received quiet thanks from their commanders. There were no public ceremonies or speeches. Their work remained secret, known only to those who depended on it. Yet in private, there was a growing respect for these operators. They had proven that their machines were more than experimental tools. As the day ended, the radar station fell silent again. The men there returned to their routines, checking equipment and logging data. They understood that another attack could come at any moment. But they also knew they had changed the course of the fight. They had seen the enemy before the enemy saw them. Across the ocean, in Japanese planning rooms, unease spread. Officers argued over what had gone wrong. Some still blamed spies or luck, unwilling to consider new possibilities. Others began to whisper about strange signals and invisible detection. The idea was too disturbing to ignore. If the Americans had such a power, it meant that every future mission might be watched from the moment it began. The pilots themselves said little. They had faced an enemy who seemed to strike from nowhere, who had anticipated their every move. To them, it felt less like a battle and more like a trap closing in. The memory of that shock stayed with them long after they left the cockpit. It was a reminder that the war was changing, and that the enemy they faced was no longer blind. The raid ended in failure before it ever reached its target. Smoke rose from the sea where Japanese planes had gone down. The few aircraft that managed to return landed with bullet holes and fuel tanks nearly empty. Ground crews counted the losses in silence. Entire squadrons had been destroyed. Experienced pilots, men who had fought since the opening days of the war, were gone. The base commander stood at the edge of the runway, watching as damaged planes limped home one by one. It was clear the mission had collapsed completely. Reports traveled quickly up the chain of command. Japanese officers studied the outcome and were stunned by the scale of the defeat. Dozens of aircraft had been lost. Skilled aviators who could not be easily replaced were dead or missing. The operation had been planned with care and secrecy, yet it had failed so completely that no one could explain why. Some believed a single scout plane or a hidden submarine had revealed their position. Others suspected that spies were feeding information to the Americans. The truth that machines had detected their planes before they even left the ground was too far outside their understanding to accept. For the Americans, the result was a sudden and powerful boost to morale. Only weeks earlier, they had been reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor. Battleships had been sunk, bases destroyed, and the enemy seemed unstoppable. Now, for the first time, the Americans had struck back with precision. The victory was not just in the air but in the unseen world of information and preparation. Radar, still secret to most, had proven its value. Commanders who had doubted its usefulness now saw how it could change the course of a battle. American pilots returned to their bases tired but confident. They had gone into the fight knowing exactly where the enemy would be. This gave them a sense of control that had been missing since the war began. Ground crews cheered their return, and for a moment, the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks faded. The success showed that the Japanese could be defeated and that careful planning and new technology could match their experience and skill. At higher levels of command, the victory was studied closely. The data gathered from radar stations, fighter reports, and anti-aircraft batteries was analyzed in detail. Officers saw how a network of sensors and communication links could allow them to predict enemy movements and strike at the right moment. This realization led to immediate changes. More radar stations were ordered. Training programs were expanded. Skilled technicians were assigned to islands across the Pacific to build a defensive net that would stretch from Hawaii to Australia. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced a painful lesson. In the weeks after the failed raid, they began to suspect that the Americans had some form of advanced detection. Interrogations of surviving pilots revealed the same story again and again. The enemy had been waiting in perfect position. Anti-aircraft guns had opened fire before the bombers reached their targets. Fighters had attacked from above, guided with uncanny precision. There was no other explanation that fit the facts. Japanese scientists and engineers were quickly tasked with studying radar. At the start of the war, Japan had some experimental systems, but they were limited and underfunded. Naval and army leaders had not considered them a priority. Now, resources were diverted to develop radar as fast as possible. New laboratories were opened, and teams worked to catch up with American progress. But they were starting from behind, and time was against them. For the United States, the success only deepened the commitment to radar research. Funding increased dramatically. New models were designed with greater range and accuracy. Portable sets were developed for ships and aircraft. By 1944, radar had advanced far beyond the early SCR-270 units. These later systems could track multiple targets at once and direct fighters with remarkable precision. The integration of radar into every level of combat reshaped the Pacific War. Airfields no longer relied solely on visual scouts. Commanders could see the flow of battle in real time. Ships used radar to navigate at night and in poor weather, reducing the element of surprise in naval warfare. Even anti-aircraft guns were linked to radar for improved accuracy. Alongside code-breaking, radar became one of the decisive factors in the Allied strategy. While cryptographers worked to read Japanese communications, radar provided immediate, physical evidence of enemy movements. Together, these tools allowed the Americans to anticipate attacks, set traps, and control the timing of major operations. The failed Japanese raid marked the moment when this shift became visible. It was more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated that information could outweigh numbers, that a smaller force could defeat a larger one through preparation and foresight. The Japanese pilots had entered the sky believing they were hidden, only to find that they had been visible from the start. In the months that followed, the Americans expanded their network further. Radar stations appeared on small islands, some little more than strips of land surrounded by coral reefs. These outposts became vital links in a growing chain. Each station extended the reach of American eyes deeper into enemy territory. Messages flowed between operators and command centers at all hours, building a picture of the war that was invisible to the enemy. The Japanese attempted to adapt. They experimented with countermeasures, such as flying at low altitude to evade detection or timing their raids to exploit gaps in coverage. They also tried to jam radar signals, though with limited success. Despite these efforts, the Americans stayed ahead. Their systems grew more complex, their operators more skilled. By mid-1944, the difference in capability was too great to overcome. Looking back, the battle in early 1942 was a turning point. It revealed the vulnerability of Japan's reliance on secrecy and speed. It showed the Americans that technology could provide a new kind of strength, one that did not depend on sheer firepower alone. The loss of aircraft and veteran pilots was painful for Japan, but the deeper loss was strategic. From that day forward, they could no longer assume they controlled the pace of the war. The Americans understood this advantage and worked to protect it. Radar remained highly classified, known only to those who operated and maintained it. To the outside world, the victories seemed like luck or sudden improvements in tactics. Inside the radar rooms, the operators knew the truth. They had seen the battle unfold before it began, and they knew that each success depended on their ability to keep watching, day and night, across the vast expanse of the Pacific. The quiet work of those radar operators reached far beyond the small, dark rooms where they sat. Their efforts in 1942 were part of a larger change that would shape the modern world. What began as an urgent wartime experiment became the basis for systems we rely on every day. The spinning antennas and glowing screens of early radar stations were crude, but they proved a simple truth. If you could see farther than your enemy, you could act first. After the war, this idea moved from the battlefield into civilian life. Engineers who had spent years designing and repairing military radar turned their attention to peaceful uses. Airports began using radar to track commercial flights. Before this, air traffic control depended on radio reports from pilots and visual sightings by tower crews. Radar gave controllers the ability to see planes even in heavy fog or at night. It made air travel safer and more efficient, allowing more aircraft to share the same skies without fear of collision. Weather forecasting also changed. During the war, radar operators had often noticed unusual patterns caused by storms. Scientists realized these same tools could track rainfall, wind, and severe weather in real time. Over time, specialized weather radar systems were developed. Today, they help predict hurricanes, monitor tornadoes, and guide everyday decisions about safety and travel. What once served as a weapon became a tool for protection and planning. Military radar did not disappear. It grew more advanced. By the late 1940s, new systems could detect faster, higher-flying aircraft. During the Cold War, radar became part of global defense networks. Massive installations were built in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland to watch for incoming bombers or missiles. These networks linked nations together, sharing information across continents. The same principle that had stopped a Japanese raid in 1942 was now being used to prevent nuclear war. This evolution did not stop. As aircraft design improved, stealth technology emerged. Engineers created planes meant to slip past radar detection. In response, radar systems grew more sensitive, able to track smaller and more elusive targets. The contest between hiding and finding never ended. Modern stealth bombers and fighter jets are the direct descendants of the planes that once launched from Japanese runways. The radars watching for them trace their roots to those early SCR-270 and SCR-271 sets built under wartime pressure. The legacy of that first clash goes beyond machines and tactics. It carries a cultural and strategic message. In the early months of the war, Japan held the advantage. Their pilots were skilled, their navy powerful, and their strategy bold. They struck first and struck hard. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed to prove that dominance. But the battle shaped by radar showed a different reality. It revealed that technological innovation could overturn assumptions. For the Japanese pilots who returned from that failed mission, the experience was deeply unsettling. They had believed in their training and their secrecy. In their view, the Americans were reacting blindly, too slow to respond. When they were intercepted almost immediately, it challenged their entire understanding of warfare. Some refused to believe what they had seen. Others quietly admitted that the enemy must have capabilities they could not match. That realization marked the beginning of a shift in the balance of power. For the Americans, the victory brought confidence but also caution. Radar gave them an edge, but it was a fragile one. They knew the enemy would adapt. Scientists and engineers were urged to improve the systems constantly. Military leaders kept the technology secret, aware that once revealed, it could be copied or countered. This cycle of innovation became part of modern warfare. The story of radar in World War II serves as a warning. It shows how easy it is to underestimate an opponent's progress. The Japanese command believed their plans were safe because they saw no sign of detection. They measured American strength only by visible ships and planes. The radar network was invisible and therefore ignored. That mistake cost them dearly. In later conflicts, nations learned to assume that unseen systems might exist, shaping decisions from the shadows. This lesson remains relevant. In today's world, the tools may be satellites, drones, or cyber networks instead of rotating antennas. But the principle is the same. Wars are decided not only by what can be seen in open battle, but by what is hidden behind the scenes. The systems that guide modern missiles, track spacecraft, and control automated defenses all trace back to that early leap in technology. In many ways, the battle that began with dots on a screen was a glimpse of the future. The Japanese pilots who lifted off that morning faced an enemy they could not see, one that acted on information they did not know existed. The Americans who fought that day were supported by men who never left their stations, whose weapons were signals and timing rather than bullets and bombs. The clash was physical and violent in the sky, but its roots were quiet and precise. The moment of interception became more than a single victory. It was the start of a new kind of warfare. It marked the point when technology began to shape strategy in ways no commander could afford to ignore. The outcome of battles no longer depended only on numbers of planes or the bravery of pilots. It depended on who could gather, interpret, and act on information faster. Today, every commercial flight tracked by radar and every weather report showing storm movements carries a connection to that past. The screens are clearer now, the signals stronger, but the concept remains unchanged. What was once a secret advantage has become part of daily life, woven into how the world moves and communicates. Looking back at that night in 1942, it is clear that the true victory did not happen only in the sky. It began in hidden workshops where engineers built strange machines, in training rooms where young operators learned to read faint signals, and in quiet stations scattered across remote islands. The battle was won before the first plane left the runway, in places far from the sound of engines or the glare of gunfire. It was a victory of foresight and preparation, a moment when the future of warfare was quietly being shaped out of sight.